Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Neil. I will be moderating today's session, but I think we're exactly on time now, so I would like to pass the mic to my colleagues to begin the session. Over.
Thank you, Neil. I think we can then start by introducing the broader concept and followed by then introduction of the panel and so on. But welcome all. I'm Paula Penan Ribeiro from UN Habitat Global Solutions Division. And let me just start by having a few words for you on the background of this UN Habitat report on cities and pandemics, and then the purpose of today. So the purpose of the report on cities and pandemics with the subtitle "Towards a More Just, Green and Healthy Future" that UN Habitat is preparing is to give a broader background to the pandemic that we are seeing facing the cities in many dire consequences. Over this year, the pandemic has made national and local governments, people and communities alike to take very strong containment measures to reduce the spread of the virus and mitigate its health and social economic impacts. By now, it's very clear to us all that the current crisis emphasizing many of the challenges that we already had, some of them most clearly felt in cities. Of jobs and markets have led to major global recession. And it's also observed that the various restrictions put in place have had exceptionally strong effects on physically and economically vulnerable populations, deepening the existing socio-economic inequalities that we already had in many cities. And the change of use of social and physical space is questioning the traditional models of spatial organization in cities and making many people become conscious about their spatial relations, perhaps the first time in their lives in cities. And the governance systems are facing daunting challenges which few governments had prepared for. Many local authorities are now learning by doing, as we see, and at best, many times doing so hand in hand with their health departments and other health experts. As both bases of disease outbreaks and as major socio-economic engines, the world cities are at the center of the crisis and at the center of responses to it. So many times this pandemic has really boiled down to cities. And as we know, the cities' responses are very critical at this moment to protect the people, curb the pandemic, and set the scene for resilience and recovery that would touch most of the people living on the planet. And as a rare one positive thing, the pandemic is an opportunity for the humankind to depart from the business as usual pre-2020 and bring in a transformative change to achieve a new sustainable urban realm. But of course, the directions of the change needs to be based on proven policies and actions by governance systems, communities, people, and businesses together. So this UN Habitat report on cities and pandemics will serve as a study of the COVID-19 response from an urban perspective, with a focus on establishing evidence-based guidance and recommendations to urban stakeholders on 4 central themes for the future in cities. Urban morphology that we discussed yesterday, urban economy, inequality, and urban governance. The first consultation with stakeholders on the analytical directions and thematic choices of this cities and pandemic report took place in June 2020. This second stakeholder engagement, which is a series of 4 thematic webinars, will consult on the report's key recommendations on the thematic discussion papers that we have been drafting. The draft discussion papers that we will debate during the webinars will, once they're fully finalized, constitute the final summary report on findings, and it's due publishing in early 2021. And the objective of today's webinar on the theme Rebuilding Urban Economy is to share the discussion paper with key partners for consultation and to gather expert feedback on the strength and validity of the key findings. So enjoy the discussion. Thanks. And over to you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Paula. Colleagues, thank you all for attending. I am Neil Kaur. I am the officer in charge of the Office of the Executive Director, and I will be moderating the session and the discussion subsequently. So if you will allow me 1 or 2 minutes to just introduce myself and also introduce the panel, and then subsequently we can proceed with the program. So first, let me complement what Paula has just mentioned and help with the setting of the scene. As you all know, COVID-19, according to the World Economic Forum, is an opportunity to reset and redefine capitalism. Basically, we cannot go back, but we need to build back better. The UCLG president stated that cities are not only at the front line of a health crisis, but need to mainstream economic resilience. As you all know, all our colleagues and our friends in the local governments are facing an acute credit crunch or financial crunch, and at the same time expected to deliver public services. And this is causing a lot of pain. But as they are also thinking about renewal, regeneration, I think the great contribution from this group is to actually look at the possibilities of mainstreaming economic resilience. With regards to the Secretary General's policy brief that has explained that resilient local economies are, how do we define that? So they are defined as inclusive ones that take into account justice, equality, sustainability, and growth within planetary limitations. And of course, being topical, the theme of the President-elect of the United States is Build Back Better. So echoing the fundamental principles of the Sendai Protocol and the Addis Ababa Accord on Sustainable Development. But more importantly, I think the key question for us to grapple with is not only how to build back better, but how to build back greener and fairer. Just a quick introduction to myself. I'm very new to the UN system. It's only been 24 months or less than that, 20 months. And formerly, I was with the investment arm of the Malaysian government called Khazanah Nasional. And some of my Malaysian friends are online. Really good to have all of them online. And I helped with the setting up an urban regeneration agency, working and supporting 157 local governments in Malaysia with demonstration projects in major cities. We also witnessed, had a front row seat in the government-linked company transformation program associated with the Asian financial crisis and the decade of restructuring of the Malaysian economy subsequent to that. And I think this may be relevant for us as we are all also thinking about how to build back better, how to build back greener from an economic perspective. So in a sense, looking at the regional investment portfolio to ensure the relevance of companies and cities. It's also clear that this chapter of the wider cities and pandemic work will need to address, to my mind, 3 critical audiences. One, national governments who have to allocate very limited resources and are looking to cities as engines of growth to generate jobs, taxes, and capital investments. Second, local governments who need to know how to regenerate their local economies to deal with immediate loss of revenue. And thirdly, the investment community, including multilateral development banks, private sector investors, all looking for ways to ensure that cities and communities are able to facilitate wealth generation to survive the pandemic. And of course, where are citizens and communities in all of this? I think at this moment, those at the margins of the urban economy are suffering the most. We all know that build better means being as inclusive as possible. But I think one key idea here is how to do that. So the linkage between spatial and economic planning was made very clear in yesterday's webinar on spatial patterns. And we had Dr. Eduardo Moreno, our in-house subject expert on that, who is also online. What is also clear is that the one-size-fits-all model will only bring us back to the unequal economic patterns of the past. What we really need to start thinking about is how to provide guidance that is pragmatic and implementable across different typologies of urbanization. With that, Paula, I'm just wondering whether I should quickly introduce the panel or we should proceed with the program and pass the mic to Marco.
Perhaps it's good to introduce the panelists.
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead, and then to Marco. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. Colleagues, please bear with me. We have a very distinguished set of panelists and subject experts. Before they come online, my colleagues will be taking us through the salient points of the chapter, focusing on both the macro level aspects, capitalism, the structure of the global economy, supply chain systems, and the operation level dynamics based upon feedback from city managers, private sector partners, and community leaders that we have been interacting with through more than 1,000 sessions or webinars, etc. Let me first introduce our only lady panelist. I must apologize. Actually, I had promised the executive director that we would only be to ensure gender mainstreaming, that we should have equitable gender representation. So I really hope my colleagues will commit to doing better in the future. But I think this topic is sort of very, very important that we have as inclusive a panel as possible, and every effort has been made to do so. So let me introduce first Ms. Edlam, who will provide us with a institutional perspective from her many years as an urban development experience, and more importantly highlights the critical situation in Africa where urbanization will be most rapid and where the opportunity to build back better is also the most apparent. So we'll be looking to her to provide pragmatic approaches to key questions around the youth bonus, debt management, urgent need for job creation. How can we engage with African cities to build back better? We also have with us, sorry. Sorry, look at my notes. Mr. Dimitri Boschidiev, apologies, from UNCDF in Africa, and he's a technical advisor based in Uganda, in charge of UNCDF programs in East Africa and Horn of Africa. Dimitri, thank you so much for coming online. As you know, we are working quite closely with Mr. David Jackson as well to look at how to ensure we work very closely together. And your expertise in local finance will be particularly important as we help cities grapple with that important dimension. We also have Mr. Diego Zavaleta from UNDP, who specializes in social policies and governance, and I think it's a specialist in social inclusion work, poverty and human development initiative at University of Oxford. And we really look forward to hearing his perspectives in ensuring that we develop an as inclusive program as possible. And of course, not forgetting the futurist, Mr. Serge Salat, who is from France, and was in our first EGM. Serge, we really thank you very much for coming online. I think the key here is envisioning the future of cities, and why are we in what is the ultimate destination of building it better, greener, and fairer. So on that note, Paula, I hand the mic over to Marco, who will take us through the report, and then I'll come back again to moderate. Thank you very much. Over to you, Marco.
Pass the mic to Bruno, please.
Okay, sorry, to Bruno.
Very good afternoon indeed. Can I ask somebody to confirm whether this shared screen is visible?
Yes, Bruno, I can see it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, good afternoon. I hope that I also can walk through this PowerPoint easily, and I will do that for my colleagues. Obviously, we have entered in the most severe economic crisis the world has seen for generation. And with this, I introduce this chapter with the necessary modesty. It is not easy to provide a concise introduction on the fate and the prospect and the way forward of cities going through a truly global economic crisis. It is even more difficult so to do for cities in developing countries. It's more difficult to do so in a time where stimulus financing is still screening of the full impacts of this crisis on households and on companies and on local authorities' budgets, and of course on countries. The objective of this chapter, as Paula described in the context of 4 chapters, was to provide that framework where we better understand these key challenges of cities as a result of going all through COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic. And as I said, clearly with a focus on cities in the developing world and with a special focus on their fiscal challenges. The impacts on budgets will define what they will be able to do going through the pandemic. After the short introduction, my colleagues Hannes Berggren and Philip Bonera, who have co-written this chapter as well, will talk about impact and short-term responses. And my colleague Marco Camilla will then make a few notes on future directions and key messages. Once more, I emphasize that the limitations on data were severe. The timing during which we have written this chapter, mainly during summer, early autumn of this year, was particularly difficult because the responses had gone forward, but on the economic side, the situation was still very, very confusing. If I tell you that yesterday the Dow Jones broke 30,000, the 30,000 mark, what does that mean for a city in the development world? Well, probably nothing, or something we don't know. So we really try to focus on the absolute important key messages. We will set them out, and also to create clarity to why within the United Nations system, and that's also why in the panel we have 3 distinguished members from the United Nations systems among us, why the Secretary General in April already came out with the socio-economic framework and the 4th pillar on macroeconomic assessment that will guide us. Why then in July he came out with a brief on the brief on COVID in an urban world, with a very strong message on supporting the capacity of cities, especially in the development world, to be able to steer recovery in the future. And of course, we put a reminder again to everybody, it's not only the SDGs that we want to achieve by 2030, notwithstanding the tremendous difficulties of COVID, but there was also the very important Addis agenda on financing sustainable development, and we have to reread it. Governments have to re-look at the commitments they make in order to pull cities in the development world through this crisis. Thank you. I pass the word to my colleague, Hannes.
Thank you very much, Bruno. If you could just move the slide on.
Should happen or not?
On my screen, I still see the first slide.
Okay, please start. That is a typical problem we have when the 2 presenters, the slide will come. I hope just flag me when you see it, but please start.
All right, I'll go ahead. Thank you. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we know, is forcing the world to fight both a health crisis and an economic crisis at the same time. The containment measures put in place to keep people safe from the virus have taken a toll on the global economy, and cities, being both on the front line of the pandemic, while also being the primary producer of global economic output, are heavily impacted by this dual crisis. Urban productive sectors and labor markets have been severely damaged, and as a result, many urban enterprises, not the least the many SMEs in the urban economy, are now facing bankruptcy. The majority of the world's people today finding their livelihoods in urban areas are in many cases finding themselves unemployed with reduced or no income. In some, we are seeing the worst economic downturn since the Second World War and an unemployment crisis worse than during the global financial crisis. These economic effects are not only vast, but also unequal. The crisis has highlighted underlying inequalities within and between cities in the world. Baseline estimates now show that the ongoing crisis is expected to push 72 million new people into extreme poverty in 2020 alone. Evidence from past events shows that women and other vulnerable groups are especially impacted in pandemics, and an adverse impact on inequality is to be expected. We also see the digital divide wider than ever before. While some cities could respond to the pandemic with data-driven technologies, others have not had that opportunity. While some workers could resort to work from home, many others have instead been left without any source of income. Especially vulnerable in this situation are the many informal workers relying on physical presence and face-to-face interaction. So we could just move on then to the next slide, Bruno. Looking more at the fiscal impact on cities. It is no secret that cities are on the front line of the pandemic, battling the virus and protecting their citizens. And such a response naturally requires significant public expenditure. Meanwhile, however, the economic repercussions of the crisis are leading to negative revenue effects. So in combination, this creates a scissor effect with increased public expenditure and reduced public revenue. Many subnational governments, especially in developing countries, rely heavily on intergovernmental fiscal transfers. This leaves them vulnerable because most transfers come as non-discretionary grants earmarked for certain activities, which restrains flexibility to adjust resources to the needs of local epidemic responses. Also, as fiscal transfers from central governments often are based on previous year's economic activity, S&G fiscal positions can worsen for several years following a crisis. Indeed, evidence has shown that this happened to subnational governments during the Great Recession. Subnational governments in developing countries also tend to have limited room for maneuver because of strict budgetary spending rules. So restrained by fiscal rules in a time of crisis, subnational governments may be forced to reduce expenditure instead of running temporary deficits, which can create a pro-cyclical effect that in turn can in fact worsen the crisis. Now, these effects have a direct on people because local governments' fiscal strength is a determinant for their possibility to protect inhabitants through building public healthcare capacity, implement track and trace schemes, ensure basic services, and provide fiscal stimulus as well as social insurance. Finally, adverse economic effects of the pandemic could be long-lasting. Evidence has shown that pandemics can have effects for up to 40 years, impacting growth and human capital for 2 or 3 generations. For this reason, the responses we take to the crisis today can make a large difference for human welfare in both the short term and the long term. So I will now leave it over to my colleague Bonera, who will further outline some of the immediate economic responses cities have taken.
Right. Thank you very much, and kindly please let me know if you can see the screen. But I can just go ahead and begin. As it has been mentioned, the pandemic has caused significant impacts on people, businesses and livelihoods, and municipal finance. And this really has been the basis of the analytical framework on which we have looked at the short-term responses that have been implemented by cities across the regions of the world. What you are seeing on the screen right now is just an analysis of the responses with the policy evidence is from cities in high-income countries marked in green, and the policy response evidences in low-income countries and middle-income countries marked in blue. We identified 3 categories for economic short-term responses. That is support to citizens and vulnerable groups, support to businesses and economic recovery, and exemptions and delays with regards to municipal taxes, fees, and charges that are charged at the local level. Now, very quickly, just to give you a general overview of the responses, cities in sub-Saharan Africa were very hard pressed to support businesses and economic recovery efforts to the businesses and SMEs in their cities. Latin America, cities in Latin America and the Caribbean had very varied responses, with some cities doing better than others. We see a very clear demarcation in responses in cities in the Asia and the Pacific regions. Cities in low income countries, low and middle income countries in the Asian Pacific had very limited responses, as you can see, with the major response being support to the citizens and vulnerable groups, while Asian cities in high income countries really performed better than their counterparts. Cities in North America and Europe are mainly from high income countries. Sorry, there's a bit of background. All right, there's a bit of background noise. All right, cities in North America and Europe are mainly from high-income countries, and they have implemented largely inclusive and integrative responses to the pandemic. The policy responses in Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia are very limited as well, with little evidence of support to businesses and economic recovery, which is required if we were to build back better, resilient urban economies. So now, as we move to the next slide, we're going to look at 3 case studies from Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Asia. To begin with, we're going to start with Freetown City in Sierra Leone, which is a city in West Africa, whose 30% of its population lives on under $1 a day. It's also quite dense, with an estimated 8,400 inhabitants per square kilometer. Now, the city also suffered through the Ebola crisis and drew significant lessons from that, and has been able to implement responses across the 3 categories that I outlined earlier. However, these responses were not entirely funded by the city, but through different multilateral mechanisms, most notably the European Union. As we move on to the second case study, Bogota in Colombia also was able to implement very integrated responses in the city. It's also a very dense city with about 6,900 people per square kilometer, with 11.6% of the population being poor. Now, interestingly though, the city over and above raising additional estimated $13 million for vulnerable populations and the healthcare sector, the city was also able to provide basic minimum income to the poorest in the city. That is also over and above the support to economic recovery efforts and exceptions with regards to municipal taxes and fees. The last case study will be Kerala state in India. And in this state, there wasn't evidence showing aggressive COVID-19 response support to businesses and economic recovery efforts, as well as municipal exemptions and supports. But really, the state deployed an approach where the state and the community collaborated in reaching the most vulnerable populations through mobilizing volunteers for relief food distribution drives. As we move over, what are these short-term responses really telling us? Number one, the multi-level response mechanisms between different levels of government, national and local, are very, very important. It is important for national governments, especially, to provide fiscal stabilization measures for local governments. As we know, and as Hannes has mentioned, most transfers are earmarked for certain expenditures, and local governments and cities are not flexible enough to sort of move, readjust priorities towards COVID-19 response. So these fiscal stabilization measures, which may include relaxing some of these fiscal regulations, are needed. Secondly, cities have not had inadequate extra support from the national government, and this has really been seen across cities, across different regions. For example, Gulu in Uganda and Chiapas in Mexico, and so on and so forth. And so increased support from national governments to local governments is really, in terms of emergency transfers, with regards to responding to the pandemic from the medium term to the long term, is of absolute importance. Thank you, and I will now hand over to Marco.
Thank you. So in this, thank you, Bruno, Hannes, and Bonera. So in these last 5 minutes, so let me pose some issues so we can get the best from you, the reviewers. So there are two final slides, one on the future of the urban economy, where the proposals are, one, invest better in cities, and two, design a new financial model. And next, the next slide. The last slide is comes with key messages, with the first saying that cities must take advantage of the pandemic to build green, inclusive, resilient, gender equal, and sustainable. And second, emphasize the need for multilateral approach and support. So I think, and I want to say this because this morning I discussed with Eduardo Moreno, who is also one of the intellectual members of this steering committee, and in order to be a little bit provocative and getting the best from the reviews, because the conclusions, just say like this, can be a little bit boring. Nothing much original said. No? So I want to say that the current draft reflects our discussions and internal debate on a number of issues, as well as as you know, the natural contradiction between planning, economy, governance, and equity. Yesterday, for example, we saw the presentation on morphology where a researcher from Brazil showed how COVID affects unequally poor population in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So today I was reading an article in The Economist on the ethnic component and inequality of COVID. So in Chicago, for example, the infection rates of Latinos are triple of whites. In England, Black Africans living in cities are 4 times more likely to die than white men if they get COVID. And Pakistanis and Indian also working in UK, in London, are twice likely to die than whites if they get COVID. So we also saw yesterday that density is not to blame, but mainly overcrowding. But this indicates the need to integrate the economy, the planning, the finance, and that's not easy task. For this report and this chapter, we know that morphology by itself is need to be integrated with the economic response. Poverty and segregation are more related with policy, but of course the solution involves smart urban planning and design. So COVID necessarily requires an integrated approach. So to have a chapter on economy that is not boring and say something different, so I want to say the following, something that we have learned in the past years. So with Serge Salah, for example, we work on the relationship between the economy and planning. And Serge was insisting how in cities from 5 to 10% of the productive central hub are composed of the main agglomeration. And that is absolutely needed for the city to be feasible. So density is, of course, concentrated in these urban agglomerations, but also provides the revenue, the jobs, and the economic activity the city needs in order to increase, and also provides the revenues, of course, for the local government. So with Dimitri, we have had long discussions on the finance, and Dimitri knows that all these financial issues are not new, just magnified by the pandemic. With Edlan, over the past 4 years, we have been discussing about productive policies and industrialization, in particular in the context of Africa and related with urbanization. So how this changed with COVID? Actually, probably not much. The policies are the same. And with Diego Zabaleta, I want to say that UNDP has been working on a proposal to implement a temporary universal basic income. UNDP also has been insisting on the need to strengthen the governance and the technical capacity of local governments. So I want to say that the reviewers, so you are talking not only to this economic drafting team, but to all UN Habitat colleagues. So I know you have prepared your interventions in advance, but I will also ask you to add, if not there yet, ideas on how to make a chapter useful and for city leaders and for central governments, and how we can articulate with the other chapters on morphology, inequality, and governance. So any ideas from you, I really appreciate. So many thanks, and now let me pass the virtual mic to Neil.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I believe we are now in the second part of the program, which is to invite our panelists to provide their feedback, their critical comments, and to start the conversation going. My suggestion is that we allow each of the panelists to provide their feedback, and then after that we engage in a Q&A. Bruno, can you please confirm how many minutes each of our distinguished panelists will have?
Sure. Neil, we had asked for each panelist to contribute to come in with a 7-minute review.
Thank you very much, Bruno. So can we start? Edlam, can I invite you to and pass the mic over to you?
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you, UN Habitat colleagues, dear friends, and for this invitation to take part in this webinar and really engage on this important initiative that UN Habitat has embarked on. I'll have interventions that are sort of broad in terms of ideas to strengthen the chapter in terms of structure, arguments, etc. But I'll also try to respond to some of the specific questions that Neil and Marco, you have raised today. So I think this chapter is really a fundamental component of the entire publication, particularly as it is foundational for the other dimensions of recovery and resilience. Understanding that questions of inequality, governance, planning and design, and so on and so forth are very closely tied to the question of economic resilience and the economic health of cities in the context of COVID and post-COVID as well. The chapter also raises many critical issues of importance to this subject matter. It also provides new data and analysis based on original research, which I found interesting to look at and to review, and which I had not seen in other publications. Having said so, I am going to provide some recommendations that I do believe can strengthen the chapter further. Firstly, the purpose of the chapter is stated as aiming to provide an analytical framework to understand the economic impact of COVID on cities. So from my own reading, I was not able to get a clear sense of the chapter's analytical framework or main framework of analysis and conceptualization. Indeed, the chapter does introduce what could potentially become main frameworks for analysis, but I didn't see these issues being followed through. Just to give an example, for instance, it speaks about exogenous and endogenous dimensions of COVID and the COVID crisis, which is really interesting and could be followed through. And then towards the end of the chapter, it speaks to the need for the economic transition at the city scale to be green, digital, and inclusive. And again, I think these concepts, they are in the chapter, but perhaps could be brought together in a comprehensive framework that would then guide the analysis and content of the chapter. So I think this, in my view, perhaps absence of a very clear framework of analysis for the paper means that some of the key messages may not come out as strongly as they could. There are a lot of issues raised, key arguments, big ticket items in the chapter, but I think these all need to be streamlined and packaged according to a main framework for the chapter. I think related to this, what I would want to emphasize is how are we thinking about the notion of economic resilience at the city scale? And I think the chapter does, again, refer to the notion of resilience, but I find that it is primarily related to the question of fiscal resilience, which is a component of urban economic resilience. But we may want to think about how to reconceptualize and rethink and reflect on the notion of urban economic resilience, knowing what we know about the COVID impacts and how it has affected cities across the board. For instance, thinking about, the structure and functioning of the urban economy, economic governance issues, labor markets, and so on and so forth as some of the key components of urban economic resilience. So I think really unpacking that point would be quite important. Of course, the chapter cannot address everything under economic resilience. And so I think the specificity of approach and the clarity of the angle that is being taken in this analysis would be quite important. And of course, this can be informed by some of the key messages in the SG's policy brief. I think related to the above, what I think the chapter could benefit from is perhaps expounding a bit more on the underlying structural economic vulnerabilities faced by cities, which did determine the extent of impact and the manner in which cities responded to the COVID-19 crisis and were impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. And so I think there is a good sort of discussion around how cities were actually impacted, but we need to say more about why they were impacted in a particular way. Why did cities respond in different ways? Why were the impacts differentiated across cities? And so I think we can say a little bit more about issues such as, for instance, the structure of the urban economy, as I was saying, the performance and functioning of the urban economy. And here I'm thinking about, for instance, issues around the diversification of the local economy and how this was, for instance, a factor in determining the way in which COVID played out in particular cities. Related to this and some of the structural vulnerabilities, we all recognize that informality is one of the underlying structural vulnerabilities in cities, especially developing countries. And the chapter, it does bring out the issue of informality, but I think this could be a lot more prominent and a more systematic approach could be taken to the question of the informal economy, with a much sharper and more critical analysis, and also integrating the question of informality more clearly in the key policy messages and recommendations of the chapter. One major issue that I had with the chapter, and I think this is quite a critical one, is that the chapter states that policy decisions at the central government level are not a focus. Neither is the stimulus financing by national governments. I'm quoting from the chapter here. And I have particular concerns with this statement for the following reasons. The first is that national and central government scale is very critical in shaping what happens at the local scale, as we all recognize. And so the way in which national economies have been in fact impacted by COVID will directly impact how national governments do or do not support local governments. Secondly, the chapter itself states that national and central government action and support is critical for local level economic recovery. And so this needs to be clear in the chapter. The national dimension is important. If we state that it is not considered in the chapter, I think there may be a risk of deepening the silo approach to looking at national economic recovery strategies and local strategies separate to one another and often without any linkages. And I think there is also a bit of a contradiction, because although the chapter states this at the beginning, that it's not looking at the national level, it does actually look quite a bit at the national level in the latter parts of the chapter. And I think in the case of Africa, for instance, to illustrate, the effects of COVID on national economies in Africa is really massive, it's cross-cutting, and it's long-lasting. We expect up to a minus 2.6 degree percentage drop in economic growth. Plummeting commodity prices means that foreign exchange earnings are dropping, with impacts on inflationary performance. And of course, fiscal space was already limited in the African context. And so there's no doubt that these dynamics will determine how national governments do or do not support local governments. So I would suggest that there is some clarity around the local national nexus and a strong messaging around the need for national economic recovery stimulus packages to very clearly integrate the urban scale, the national scale, and local governments in that conversation and the decision making around that. Another quick comment relates to the question of green and sustainable solutions. The chapter does refer to green innovation, green growth investments, and green transition. But again, I feel that this is one of the areas that could come out much more strongly and much more centrally across the chapter. It could be strengthened from that perspective. On the question of digitization and technology, I like the fact that this is included in the chapter, but perhaps it could be broadened to consider the digital economy more broadly. Beyond looking at digital solutions for service delivery, we need to consider how the digital economy is really a part of the future of the urban economy going forward. I also like very much the analysis around the level of economic response by cities. You've tried to analyze 125 cities globally, but my question here is, how are you defining economic response and the intensity of economic response? So while the arguments being made are profound, I think we need to substantiate this with further clarification on the methodology and concepts, particularly the assertion that inequality matters and that countries with more equality deliver more economic responses is an important assertion, but it needs to be substantiated. Similarly, in analyzing the variability of economic responses of cities and countries, I think we need to look a bit more closely as to the categories that have been defined. For instance, support to people, support to businesses, and fee and charge exemptions. These may not be mutually exclusive, and so I think unpacking them a bit further may be quite important. On the future of the urban economy and the key messages sections, I have similar concerns and recommendations for these two. I think they would both benefit from specificity as to the 3-4 key issues and pillars that are being put forward as the main priority solutions. I have the sense that we're addressing many issues, many important issues, some major concepts and notions, some of them being introduced, I think, too late in the concept in the paper. For instance, the notion of agglomeration principles and economies, urban structural transformation. I think these are very foundational concepts and notions that could inform the chapter and its analysis right from the beginning, particularly if we're talking about a transformational economy for cities in the future. And I think some streamlining between the key messages section and the future of the urban economy required in response some thinking around how to differentiate these clearly and how to make the arguments and the recommendations clearer, more succinct and practical is needed. Just concluding, I think we need a stronger recommendation and perspective on strengthening urban economic data, which is indeed the weakest when we consider data availability at the city scale. I think finally, really thinking about creating coherence with other initiatives. As an example, we do have a UN Development Account project currently running in 16 cities, which we are implementing as ECA together with other regional commissions, UNCDF and UN Habitat. And that project does actually have a conceptual framework and some key principles and practices defined. So I think there could be a bit more synergy between that initiative and this paper, and of course other similar initiatives I think are being put out there by other organizations. One quick final point, I do agree with you, Marco, there's a need to really bring out the linkages between questions of morphology, density, spatial planning, and economic outcomes at the city scale and the national scale. That did not come out strongly from a quick reference to agglomeration economies and structural transformation at the end of the chapter. So I think that could come out right at the beginning as a framework and a framing principle for the analysis. But otherwise, I think really a good chapter that has all the components, but could benefit from some focusing and refining to bring out the key messages and recommendations much more strongly. Over to you, and apologies for taking too much time.
Okay, Adam, thank you so much. I think the comments are very, very helpful. Colleagues, I have also taken notes, so I will share them with you all later. But I think very succinctly, Adam, I think you're quite right. There is a lot to unpack. We will benefit from operational definitions of certain very basic concepts, and then strengthen the entire chapter by more specificity, some deep dives, and stronger recommendation. On that note, can I now invite Dimitri for your intervention? Over to you. Is Dimitri online?
Marco, you may have to go to the next panel member. Dimitri had a delay. Perhaps he has not yet connected.
Okay, in that case, can I invite Diego?
Hi. Yes, hi. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much to UN Habitat for the kind invitation. And I would like to start by congratulating you guys for the report. I think that given the centrality of territorial concentration of population in the world, report pointing to the specific dynamics affecting urban areas is not only welcome but crucial to understand and design a way out of this crisis. My comments are really influenced by the area, by my area of work, which is Latin America and the Caribbean. So please bear with me if they are not that central to other areas of the world. But I would like to make 3 comments. I think I will put them all together in three areas. The first one is about governance. At least in Latin America, in several countries in Latin America, the health and the economic crisis are quickly evolving into a governance crisis. Yeah, we see this pattern already, and this has with, in some cases, the crisis has exacerbated already ongoing governance crisis, like in Chile. In others, it has triggered this crisis. So by what we are looking at is that these crises are revolved around the strong discussions about the rules of the game. Yeah, they are trying to change the jure power, for example, again in Chile through a constitutional assembly, or they are affecting de facto power, right? Groups of power that are becoming, due to the crisis, more powerful, others which are losing their own power. So this is all these will have, of course, crucial effects on the outcomes of development. Yeah, think about the discussions that are going on right now about what is the future of social security, right? many of these countries suddenly received the crisis, let's say, or started the crisis, and they realized that the weakness of their social security systems, right? Or how they had to use the different schemes for fighting poverty, like the cash transfers, as a substitute in a way of sound systems of social security. So there's a lot of discussion going on there. There will be strong discussion about tax systems, how changing them, how redistributive they must be to face this crisis and after this. This is linked, of course, to demands on better and more universal health systems, and the discussions on what to do about education and distance learning, for example, to avoid whole generations getting severely affected by crises of this type. So this is clearly an opportunity as well, as it was mentioned at the beginning, at the opening. And a clear opportunity as well for the discussion you are having in the paper. So a key discussion will be, of course, the structure of the state pertaining to decentralization and local governance, for example. And thus, I think that a clear guidance on frameworks that could untangle some of these constraints that you discuss in the chapter, like the financial constraints, would be very, very helpful in the chapter. My second point is about inequality, and this is the issue is rightly pointed out in the chapter. We know by now that global inequalities and inequalities between countries have been declining since 1980s, yet inequalities within the countries have been on the rise. Yeah? This makes us question severely to what extent do these within countries inequalities are reflected throughout the territory, right? More importantly, what do they imply in terms of policy challenges and governance deficits? Yeah, and linked to this is that we really need to see inequalities in a broader way, like we usually do as well from the UN system, but go and make proper analysis about horizontal inequalities, about which are inequalities between groups rather than between people, because the spatial inequalities have added. They have become more important when spatial and regional divisions align with political and ethnic tensions, yeah, to undermine social and political stability. So this links needs to be addressed properly. And for all this, of course, we need better data, something that we have been pushing throughout the UN system for a long time, but it's very clear that we need more and better data to analyze this and be able to define policies to address this. And also crucial to understand the reality of inequality is to see the different disparities that we are witnessing at the territorial level, right? Environmental disparities in the access to public services, to living conditions like crime, violence, or the distance to workplace. But also more hidden disparities that we don't usually measure, like discrimination or isolation, right? Aspects which are crucial for the living standards of people. Now, the few data that is available for these territorial disparities, because usually, as you know, we have data for urban rural comparisons, but not on smaller territories, show shocking realities in Latin America. As you know, we can see disparities in life expectancy of even 18 years for women in the city of Santiago of Chile between the higher income neighborhoods and the lower income neighborhoods, or 11 years for Mexico City. So it's shocking disparities that we see. So if we are going to take seriously the leaving no one behind, then of course addressing territorial inequalities is a priority. And for this, we definitely need more and better data. I have run out of my 7 minutes, but I'll just end up with a third comment that I think it's very interesting, very important, and you pointed out in the report as well. This reform of the regulatory framework that you talk about needs to be addressed also not only within countries, as you rightly discussed, but it's also to address it between countries, right? We are seeing important bottlenecks, for example, in e-commerce for trade, because the frameworks are different between the countries for this. And at this point, we see how relevant it is to have all these harmonized to be able to prevent these bottlenecks. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diego, for bringing that very interesting dimension. I picked up how economic crisis is now a governance crisis. That the very strong political economy dimension, and I think what you brought into the conversation complements what Edlem has been saying, that this chapter needs to strong linkage between national level policy and local government policy, and this is played out very, very clearly in the inequality issue. Colleagues who are online, I've been informed by my colleague Bruno that if you would like to ask questions and all that, please start populating the message box so that we can collect the questions. What I would like to do is to let the panel members have their 7 minutes, and then after that we'll open to Q&A. I hope that is acceptable. I think Dimitri is now online, so I would like to pass the mic to Dimitri. Dimitri, over to you. Dimitri, are you here? Looks like he's not here yet. So can I invite Search?
Yes, you can. Okay, can you hear me well now?
Yes, very well, and I can see you as well.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, first thank you to you and Habitat, and I'm happy the way the discussion is evolving, and because some things I wanted to say have already been said, particularly by Marco and just more recently by Diego. So yeah, there is first I wanted to stress the fact that yesterday there was a very strong intervention by Jenny Birch about place matters, and I think place matters is really a key message of UN Habitat. And to be frank, there is a kind of discrepancy between the very elaborated way the morphology chapter has been elaborating the place matters at different scales, from the city to the neighborhood to the block, and the fact that even if the economy chapter refers to place, at some points it's very much placeless. We talk about individuals, about groups, but about they are not physically located into places. And actually, the place is probably a way to reconcile and to make a more integrated approach between economic recovery and just green and healthy future, which is also really important. So what I would like to address is to give a little bit more data. Already data has been given, but same thing is not just Santiago de Chile or Mexico. London is the same. You have 17 life year expectancy differences between neighborhoods in London. And it's totally specialized. There is a report by the Mayor of London, signed by Boris Johnson at the time when he was Mayor of London, stating that when one moves on the subway, on the tube, London Tube, from Liverpool Street is the City of London, the financial center, eastwards, you lose 1 year of life expectancy at each subway station move. So move east. Okay, same in, and so differences are ranging from 1 years in Tottenham Green ward in Haringey to 88 years in Queensgate ward in Kensington and Chelsea. Same in New York. And one interesting thing also about inequality is that inequality is not just inequality between nations or inequality between groups or inequality between women and men or inequality between black and white. It's inequality between neighborhoods. The story in New York and poverty is not just a question of opposing poor countries and rich countries. In New York City, half of the population lives near or below the poverty rate. And it is also specialized by neighborhood with differences of 10 to 15 years. And to come to COVID, the places, it's not just the COVID has not just struck Latin Americans or Latin Americans or Black Americans. It has struck neighborhoods more than others. The Queens had the highest rates of COVID-19 in July, with one people infected out of 23 people, and 1 people died out of 244 people. So that is 8 times more death per capita than in Manhattan. So once again, that density has nothing to do with it. The Manhattan is more dense than Queens, but the prevalence and the healthy the wall, so the spatial aspect, the community, the unhealthy community, and access to job has something to do with it. And access to jobs is about agglomeration, it's about integrating the labor market. And once again, here the figures are striking. People living in Long Island City have access in New York, have access to 2.3 million jobs in 45 minutes transit. And people living in South Brooklyn have access to 70,000 jobs. 70,000 jobs opposed to 2.3 million jobs. And so we have a convergence of the economic deprivation, lack of access to jobs, unhealthy neighborhood, a weak life expectancy, and COVID is killing people who have already very low life expectancy compared to others. And all this is totally specialized within the same cities, and in many cases within global wealthy cities. So what does it mean in terms of recommendations? Because this is also a point which would benefit, actually, the report has recommendations, but it's at the kind of a global city scale. It's quite integrative, but the action roadmap doesn't stand out. But if you look at the action roadmap of cities like New York before the COVID struck, had already perceived the issue of the lack of access to jobs and the spatial correlation between poverty, unhealthiness, and lack of access to jobs years before the COVID. And the plan was to target 25% increase in transit access to jobs and targeting the most deprived neighborhoods in terms of lack of access to jobs, with the putting 90% of New Yorkers accessing at least 200,000 jobs within 45 minutes transit. This, according to me, is not at all transformed by COVID. Why? Because, and this is also a point where the report would benefit more in-depth discussion. It's about the digital opportunity. Yes, we have seen that well-educated people in wealthy city, in already digitalized sectors, have coped very well with the pandemics by moving to remote work. But this is not the solution for everybody. We have seen yesterday in the discussion about Brazil that only 10% of Brazilians can use remote work, and overnight, not 90%. So the report would benefit more in-depth discussion about the inequality, not just inequality towards digitalization, but the risk also of digitalization. How many jobs will destroy digitalization? How many it will create? It's not just like the future of urban economy will leave people behind and risk to leave people behind. And only something which is also to e-commerce, e-education. There is clearly economies of scales in e-commerce. That means there's a small a bookstore around the corner may turn to digitalization and have a click and collect system for people to order books, and this is already happening in Paris. But are they going really to compete with Amazon if in a massive transformation towards digitalization? And still there is a lot of physicality. A lot of jobs are local jobs with local people, and the idea that the hybrid models of remote work are likely to persist, but for the well-educated people in the already digitalized sectors. So in between, and the issue is of the impact of digitalization, e-education. This is also something which is really a complex topic. Some people can benefit from remote education, and some people will be left behind remote education. And it's not just only a question of digital divide. It's a question because all the young kids, they have mobile phones, and they have digitally educated. They have been born into a digital world, but they are not able to benefit from digital education because for benefiting from here, you need to have you need to have this also healthy neighborhood, and not all neighborhoods are going to leap into the digital world. So that leads, and I will finish on that. The previous recommendations were good. Actually, it's not a question of challenging too much the new urban agenda or the SDGs. They remain very strong guidelines, except that, like this policy in New York of improving the neighborhood, and the New York policies are very much neighborhood based. We still need neighborhoods with high economic and human density, with mixed use, healthcare, education, and we need mass transit connectivity to increase the labor market and the economic opportunities of these people. We need to demystify the density topic. Yesterday it was really interesting, the intervention about the architecture of density, once again by Eugenie. Nobody is really realizing that density can be green. Densities like the one advocated by UN Habitat of 15,000 people, and I would add 7,500 jobs per square kilometer, can be reached by fabrics of 4-5-story buildings, open perimeter blocks, vibrant public realm, green factor ratio of 50%, regreening 50% of the land, 50% open space, carbon neutrality, and we have examples. We have Hammarby Sjöstad, we have Malmö in Sweden, which were actually renovation of industrial land. Not just high-end projects, but show that, once again, neighborhood scale green density. Urban agriculture, there was a discussion yesterday, and urban agriculture necessary. I'm concluding, sorry. Necessary for health, because one of the reasons COVID is killing those people is that they don't have access to healthy food. So there is obesity and cardiovascular disease challenges. So this is an integrated vision of economic development of neighborhoods, which brings together social justice, health, and economic local development. So there is a granularity of the economic recovery, which I think should appear more at action level. The action level, the city is an action level, it's a policy level, it's a financial level. But then when you come at action on the ground, it should be targeted to communities and also involve communities into the recovery. I finished on that.
Thank you so much. I think you have really brought up something which I'm a trained as a historian, so of course I really value this place-based idea the concept of the genus loci, and having come from Penang, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which I had helped with the creation of a special area plan and looking at the entire city, literally street by street. I really think that the dimension that you have brought into the conversation is very important. And one key point is that yes, the chapter is about urban economy, but it should not be about a placelessness, and trying to really bring it down to the recommendations into a kind of human level, in a kind of understanding it from a neighborhood perspective. I think that's really very vital and important. And I've taken a lot of notes. Such, thank you very much. I think that the very creative way of seeing how we can also use this opportunity to link this chapter with all the other chapters. I think that's really very important. Thank you so much for your intervention. Dimitri is now back online. Dimitri, the mic is yours. 7 minutes. Thank you. Dimitri, are you online? Bruno?
Hi, Neil. He may have an internet problem because he was online when Sergio spoke and when Daniel spoke, Diego spoke.
Okay.
He has disappeared again. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
In that, no problem. In that case, can we, once he tries to come back online, we'll definitely give him his 7 minutes. But can we now perhaps move to Q&A? I think at the very beginning, I had already set out some fundamental questions. Basically, how does this chapter really meet the policy needs at national level? How does it engender alignment between national, local, and community level participation in the building back better, greener, and fairer concepts, and also looking at some of the interventions made by our panelists. So I would like to open the floor to questions. I know that there are already some comments. Bruno, I'm just wondering, should I use chat or? Okay,
yeah,
there are.
Yeah.
Okay. Firstly, from Christopher Rollo, how to highlight economic value creation of cities and the disruption of value chains because of COVID. This can also be related to urban morphology discussion on multiple centralities and shorter value chains. Shall we take another one from Lucia, a question about political economy of COVID-19 and its impact on national and local government responses? Who is making COVID-19 decisions? Who are the influencers? What has been the strategic positioning of cities? So these are the first two questions. Bruno, are these to be addressed to the panelists or to the writers of the chapter?
I suggest that Marco provides a brief answer, but please, Neil, then I would pass the floor to the panelists.
Okay, all right. So Marco, maybe you can get us started.
No, just please proceed. I will comment later.
Okay. Panelists, would anyone would like to take on the question of Christopher Rollo on how to highlight economic value creation of cities, looking at the value chains, etc. Perhaps Adlam, can I ask you to start the ball rolling?
Yes. Well, I hope I have understood the question on the issue of economic value creation of cities, and because this is being linked to the question of morphology, I think I would want to approach it from that perspective, and I want to support the previous speakers in putting forward strongly the need to really look at how
the way in which cities are designed, planned, the spatial layout is really intrinsically associated with the economic performance of cities, their productivity, the structure of their economies, and of course, what it means to live in a city and access to opportunities in a city. So I think on the question of value creation by cities, be it in terms of, productivity, jobs, sort of livability and well-being and so on and so forth, all of those aspects were certainly impacted by COVID, but are also very, very strongly linked to morphology, location, and urban design. And I think one question I had in looking at the chapter was really, what is that sort of added value and a specificity that this chapter and UN Habitat can bring to the argument? And I think it is exactly this. It is connecting the economy with space, the economy with place, and really looking at what that means, not just for individuals that live in cities, but also firms and businesses and investment, and ultimately really looking at how the physical and morphological functions and dysfunctions of cities is directly associated with, the performance of national economies, be it in terms of revenues, be it in terms of job creation, in terms of productivity. So I think this question of morphology and bringing that into this chapter very strongly is of fundamental importance, and would very clearly link it to the first chapter and yesterday's discussions. But really unpacking that and, in a sense, arguing that the question of place and space and urban design and planning is not just for the purpose of, physically well-designed cities, well-functioning cities, but it also has a very strong impact and role on the economic performance of cities, the economic performance and efficiency of businesses and firms, and the economic access of people that live in cities. And really, we've seen how this has played out during COVID, how the physical and morphological dysfunctions of cities, particularly in developing countries, but also developed countries, shaped the way in which cities and individuals in cities were impacted by COVID, were able to respond to COVID and really react to the pandemic and crisis. So I'm not sure if I've understood the question clearly, but that is how I would look at the intervention from Christopher Rollo. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Edlam. I think that's a very comprehensive and interesting way to link morphology as a key feature of our discussion on economic, the urban economy. I think how you've approached it is also very, very relevant to how Saj was talking about, spirit of place in a sense. Anyone else would like to come on this particular?
Can I just add just some ideas on that? There is one key aspect which has been very much promoted by UN Habitat, and that could be brought again into the discussion in the public space. The public space is a driver of prosperity. Streets are drivers of prosperity. I think there is a UN Habitat report on that. And there should be more research, more promotion of these previous works, and you have examples. Of course, the examples that come to mind to me, but are quite high-end examples. But they are high-end examples of transformation of derelict areas with a lot of social problems into thriving digital economy hubs in 15 years. It's just, I think of King's Cross Central area in London. When you look now at King's Cross Central area in London, it looks like Google headquarters, great projects, great public space, super high connectivity to the rest of Europe. It looks super high end. Just figure out and look at pictures and look at what it was 15 years ago. It was a neighborhood, poor neighborhood, with the derelict old industrial buildings and a lot of crime and poverty. So, and the strategy for transforming the neighborhood has been high quality public space, which has attracted companies and which has attracted and to create also a school of design, but basically high quality public space connectivity, creating 10 new connective streets. And this doesn't address directly the question about the value chain, but it really addresses the question about relocalizing production and for shortening value chains and not depending only from things produced and assembled thousands of kilometers away. We need to have these thing local places with creative and knowledge activity, and you can transform not overnight, but in 15, 20 years, and have an influx on investment, private investment coming into very, very derelict places, just because you have the good planning strategy. Of course, we should not just build that on King's Cross, but it should be also a good thing to look at other case studies around the world where derelict places have been transformed into thriving local, and when I mean local, it's community economies. And it can be not just like, once again, digital and knowledge economy, but places in Africa, places in Latin America. Medellin is an example very, very often quoted about with the cable car. What are the acupuncture, the targeted interventions into connectivity and public space, which makes community economy thrive? And that's I get closer to the story of the value chains here, because it does mean that we don't close. I'm not against the worldwide value chains, but we have learned something that we need to rely more on locally produced things, and it creates local jobs, and it creates more resilience. So a better balance between a global economy and the thriving local economy. And when I mean local economy, it's not just entire cities. Really, like how do you make a favela thrive and be and have a local economy? And there are very, very, very little literature about, because I have written a chapter for the UN, for UN Environment, about developing thriving local economies and local neighborhoods. There is very, very little literature about making an action plan for economic development of a neighborhood or of a community. And when I mean a community, it's not a community, it's not the entire city. It's a community of 15,000 people.
Thank you very much, Serge, for that intervention. And of course, I'm again reminded of the Malaysian model as well. And I think that there's now a real deep soul searching, particularly in that line. To think about how to. I mean, some cities which were quite dependent on trans-border businesses are suffering inordinately, and also those that are very much dependent on international tourism. But at the heart of it, the like you said, the smaller communities are able to be more resilient because they obviously can bounce back much better, and they can. I think there's also a project in Kabul where with the Aga Khan has been involved, where again strong community efforts were allowed for them to transform what were originally cultural projects into medical facilities, etc. I would like to go to the question on the political economy and perhaps bring in Diego. Diego, would you like to expand on this question from Lucia? That the chapter could also benefit from analysis of political economy of COVID-19, who are actually the decision makers, etc. And because your intervention on Latin America, I think automatically leads to this. Over to you, Diego.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's a crucial question. As I said, at least in Latin America, we are seeing a very strong unfolding of a governance crisis that, of course, brings in all these elements of the political economy, and we really don't know how to. I think countries don't yet know very well how to untangle some of these things. So let me bring this example: the tax system. Okay. So there is no much fiscal space in any of these countries to start any big reform right now. So they will either need to be strongly supported by multilateralism, or they will have to make very deep changes in each country, right? Who pays taxes, how they are paid, how they are spent. So this will, bring, I mean, we haven't even seen massive changes even in when political phenomenons like in Bolivia have occurred. I mean, if you look at Bolivia with a very strong government of Evo Morales, a very with a lot of hegemony. He hasn't even changed the tax system that was set in place originally in 1985 as by, among others, Jeffrey Sachs for the stabilization program. Okay, so and this hasn't happened because it goes to such fundamental problems like who can you tax, and many of these countries jump immediately to VAT because it's easy to collect. So you're speaking about a structured problem of collecting the tax, but also it's less complicated to tax the general population than to tax the specific power groups, right? So we will see a lot of discussion there and a lot of problems to solve these situations, because this, of course, will have to go severely into taxing capital gains, into taxing properties, into taxing wealth, aspects which in Latin America have been, as you know, taboo and untouchable for a long time. So that would be a very big discussion that will require a lot of elements to define. The other situation that is coming in very quickly is, of course, the social security and universal health systems, right? And again, it requires a very open discussion about all the political economy elements of that. And again, people are very, I think it's a common demand in Latin America about the universal health system, yet it's not clear how you are going to finance that, right? And it takes us back to the tax issue. But then social security systems, like I was pointing out, they have been so weak that if you think about how we are addressing right now the emergency in many of these countries, something that I mentioned very quickly in my presentation, they are just jumping to use what we have for cash transfer systems, for example, that, these are instruments that we designed to fight poverty. And as imperfect as they are, they were, in a way, a very a skeleton of a very badly designed social security system for the poorest population. Okay, but given that there are no other, than the rest is so weak, we are taking advantage of those to transfer, resources and to de facto do social security right now. So that has to change, and people know that has to change. Countries know that has to change, but how do you change that with zero fiscal space? So yes, political economy is going to be at the core of this discussion, and as I said, this will bring the big discussion on how we affect the rules of the game, both de jure and de facto. And we will see how that evolves. In Chile seems to be, there's a big agreement of doing a constitutional assembly that will define a new constitution. Certain things will change there, and hopefully that will give space to keep on going. But Chile is a country that has a lot of fiscal space. I don't know how this discussion is going to unfold in Ecuador, for example, or Colombia. you know. So there's a lot to see and a lot to learn, and clearly a lot to think about in these terms. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Diego. That's really very interesting, and I'm of course reminded of the Asia Pacific response subsequent to the Asian financial crisis. There was a lot of soul searching, a lot of pain, a lot of called the ersatz economy. I think you can see that in Korea, and of course in our case here in Southeast Asia, we have introduced what's called a windfall tax. So I don't know whether you all know that there's a very famous Malaysian company called Top Glove. So every single glove, every single face mask, and also a special implement that men uses are produced here. And I think they just had to pay a $400 million windfall tax. This is not something that we can promote across the board, but definitely the political economy dimension is very important, and that is where also I'm not sure, because Marco, maybe you can address this, but societies which are a little bit more equal, where there is a little bit more space for civil society to air their concerns. Those are societies that perhaps are a little bit more able to strengthen their social security, social safety nets, which I think is sort of very important. We haven't had a gender dimension because women and girls are particularly vulnerable in this COVID situation, particularly in the job market. And of course, all of you know how taxing it is, even for those of us who are lucky enough to be able to work from home. Caregiving, etc., is necessity for you to be at home, and this is actually having an inordinate impact. So I'm just wondering if, Marco, maybe you can come in on this, just to elaborate where in this chapter are we addressing that gender dimension. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So this has been a fascinating and very useful discussion from Edlan, from Dimitri, and from Diego. Unfortunately, Dimitri hasn't been able to connect, and the purpose was to discuss more on the SAC national finance. But we will have a bilateral later, and we can share the discussions. What I see is that. We have to strengthen the introductory framework. I completely agree with Edlam that this is some of the weaknesses of this, that is starting, pointing into so many directions. In some way, this is also part of our internal discussion, so we have to solve this. And then the mandate for this chapter comes from two sides. So one is to strengthen the placemaking, as Serge mentioned, and my colleagues are also always insisting on how to strengthen the urban economy part in relation with the morphology. And then you have all the issues on how to design economic policy, which is not the same thing as the urban economy. So we will have to think about how to design well this. And finally, on the framework for finance, this chapter is related not only with the morphology, but with chapter 1 and 2, that is the first on governance and the second on inequalities. And I agree with Diego that all these things, inequality, for example, it has its own political economy. So inequality is not going, just by targeting inequality, is not going to solve the issues of the COVID-19 or the next pandemic. This is something that we will have to put more thinking. On the issue of density, so we have to look closely on the definition and probably redefine what we understand by density. So we have a rule of thumb at UN Habitat, but to what extent this is still valid after the COVID-19? So that's something that I'm not sure, and we should discuss further. So all this, I think, is just a lot of homework that we have to do, and we are going to work on this. But I think it will be useful to comment from Eduardo. Actually, this morning we were discussing, on what will be the specific messages from this chapter. Something that I concern about is that the audience for these are local governments and central governments and our line ministries. Not to what extent we can prepare a chapter and a publication that is integrated and our counterparts find useful. Eduardo, if you are there.
Eduardo, are you online? Marco, he may not be online.
No, he's online, but I don't know.
Marco, there was one other question, which was from Emra, and whether or not any part of the economy has benefited from COVID-19.
Can you hear me?
Any part of the economy? Just before that, I just want to say, I just want to mention that that this chapter reflects the internal discussion and the contradictions of the different areas. The chapter, we started this 8 months, actually 7 months ago in July, and the pre-draft, it was 60 pages. So just adding a lot of information. So there were sections discussing gender, for example, that I think we have to put back. Another long section on the main framework. That's something we should also consider to include. But Eduardo, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I don't want to repeat some of the important comments made. I would like to interrogate more 2 or 3 things. The first one, let me start with something that Neil said at the very beginning. And he quoted someone saying that perhaps COVID will reset and redefine capitalism. And throughout of this discussion, I don't see anything else, I would say, reaffirming or contradicting that statement that to me is an extremely important one for this chapter. For instance, some of the UN agencies and regional commissions are mentioning that it's very important to go for universal income, universal social security. UN Habitat in one moment mentioned some form of universal housing social responses, which in my view calls for a welfare state or a different welfare state. The question is this chapter going to make some arguments for that, or we are just being contented to respond to the need to address some of the neoliberal system responses that weaken the state and call for the need of a different form of a state, or we are just going to respond to building back better and to mainstream economic resilience, keeping basically systems as they are. I think some form of position needs to be taken in this chapter. Second, I fully agree with some of the comments of colleagues, so as I said, don't repeat, but this notion of EDLAM, of the analytical framework, is important in different forms. One, the chapter needs to respond to a fundamental question. Cities have been affected in different forms. A different form of cities and function of cities have been affected. Some cities that were tourist cities or service cities or having some form of extractive economies associated to value chains were differently affected, and the report should make an analysis of this, understanding that disruption in the economy are mainly twofold in my view. One is local incomes or local sources of income, and the second is national transfers. And the question is, simple one that we need to respond, how cities are going to recover from that based on this. Third important point in my view, it's as we, the new economic geography is telling us, and this is something that we said in some of the new reports, that large conglomerations like urban corridors, mega regions, mega corridors are representing new forms of economic advantage in cities. what is the connection of this to the report? In other words, how do we analyze the regional dimension of city growth and development? How are cities in these urban corridors integrating responses, or are they responding by themselves? In that sense, in one of the reports we mentioned that the successful or prosperous cities are mostly in successful or prosperous regions. So do we need regional responses for the COVID or not? And in my view, it's something that we should address. I fully agree with Lucia. We have central and local responses that are differentiated, some of them that are connected. How do we strengthen the connections? How do we annex? How do we respond to political economy analysis is, I think, extremely important. And finally, what Serge mentioned in place matters, fully agree also with Eugene yesterday. The question to me is, I think almost no one is disputing the idea of some form of neighborhood sustainability in order to address structural economic problems and social structural problems. And it was mentioned about the 15-minute cities. The question to me is, in this chapter, how do we connect planning and what kind of new economic model is needed for these 15-minute cities? And if we are not going to integrate a 15-minute city, that perhaps is quite difficult in many places, the question will be how place-based responses in the sense of neighborhood sustainability are going to be integrated in a new economic model. It's something to be discussed. And finally, it's how to articulate policies in the long-term perspective for real greener and climate change cities and countries. What is the role of the urban economy? And in that sense, what is the role that it was not mentioned of anti-cyclical responses associated to the economic recovery? Some are those of my initial reactions to this. Thank you very much, Neil and Marco.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, and always a wonderful pleasure to have you bring to bear all the different Marco, I haven't forgotten my gender question, which you have not answered. So I perhaps Edlem or anyone else who wants to bring this to bear. I think it's very, very important not to forget women in this discussion. Angela and my colleague is here. So Angela, I'm doing my duty. So can I pass it to Marco? Marco, over to you.
Yeah, no, I just want to mention that in the long draft, this was included, and we have mentioned just a couple of paragraphs, but we can expand that. Hello?
Yeah. Let's revisit that because I'm not sure whether all the ladies will be happy with a couple of paragraphs. Not just ladies, but even, you know, holistically, there's a political economic dimension as in all those important key areas mentioned by Serge, by Edlem. I think we really need to take that inclusive dimension into account. We have about 3 minutes before I pass the mic to Raf for wrapping up. Colleagues, anything else you would like to bring up? I would really encourage all of you who are attending to also please submit your questions. And Angela has just mentioned that not just women, but the full dimension of social inclusion categories, people with disabilities, older persons, children. I think we did mention about the impact on school children, etc. And don't forget that the whole idea of talent development is central to the concept of place and cities as agglomeration centers. Yes. Yes, please.
I just wanted to make exactly the same point that Angela said, that I have seen the gender paragraphs, if I can call them that, in the chapter. But I think we need a much broader perspective, again, conceptualizing what we mean by an inclusive urban economy, not just inclusion broadly, but really from an economic sense. And that then would require us to look at women, yes, gender as one of the main sort of dimensions of analysis, but really looking at all the other issues raised earlier around inclusion, access, equity, inequality, and so on and so forth. And so I think this goes back to my earlier point that the chapter sort of concludes by saying that the transition should be green and inclusive. Yet there's a need to unpack this and let this run through the entire chapter as a basic perspective or lens of analysis. Inclusion is really a key point that needs to run through the chapter. Over.
Thank you very much, Lem, for that input. I think Dr. Asmizam from Malaysia would like to make an intervention, and if I'm not mistaken, I see a hand from Dimitri. So, Dr. Asmizam, a quick intervention, and then followed by Dimitri. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Neil. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak something about the Malaysia's in the perspective of economic resilience. That COVID-19 pandemic health crisis is the biggest challenge that affected our economy, and many people lost their jobs, sources, income due to this challenge, and one of the requires special attention and detail. Therefore, the restructure of our new government with the re-established economic planning units had a central agency under the Prime Minister Department to replace the Ministry of Economic Affairs is a proof that the Prime Minister is paying special attention to ensure the Malaysia economy sit on the sound foundation. Economic planning units now focusing on the 12th national plan, which tabled to the Parliament this coming December this year. The Economic Planning Unit is among the leaders of the Economic Action Council in formulating the medium-term plan to strengthen the country economy. Therefore, I hope is helpful this discussion to helpful channel to source the reference for the target group, fulfill the purpose of approaching and strengthening the relationship between the EPU and others stakeholders in this region. Therefore, my last intervention, we like to inform that our departments, economic planning unit and related economy matters, so the planning, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of policy and holistic programs can be realized towards achieving the goals and socio-economic development of the country, especially during the pandemic. That's all from me, Dr. Neil. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asmizam. Can we just hear from Dimitri before I pass the mic to Raf? Yeah? Dimitri, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bruno. And it's been an interesting discussion to the extent that I have been able to listen to it. The connection is a bit unstable here. I wanted to mention 2 points, and congratulations, of course, for a well-crafted chapter. A very significant contribution, I believe, to building our collective knowledge about the impact of pandemics, and particularly the shocks where we have economic shocks, where we have a combined impact of suppressed aggregate demand and aggregate supply, as well as effects on global and regional supply chains. So the 2 points are, one, concern inequality. And I could hear here discussion about further breakdown of inequality and differing levels of inequality even within the same urban centers. But here I would like to talk about inequality between larger cities and towns or secondary cities. There are also different levels of inequality and also different nature of inequality in these two. And our larger cities are characterized, as we all know, by higher levels of inequality, whatever measurement we apply. So understanding how it impacts the larger cities, metropolitan cities, primary cities as they are called, and disaggregating that impact for smaller cities would be, again, a useful contribution to understand the overall impact. We now have some assessments. I have seen a few for South Africa, I believe, and Serbia, to mention just two, the impact on on inequality in terms of the Gini coefficient. So we can use it to at least get some more specific idea about the impact of inequality on the urban areas beyond the general statement, rather general statements in the chapter as it is at the moment. The second point concerns financing, the financing aspect of the impact. And you know, whereas in principle, I support the strategic change in the composition of the fiscal space of cities, I'm referring to the pyramidal diagram. I believe it's figure 5 in the draft. I don't have the draft in front of me. So strategically, yes, this is what should be what we should be thinking about. But in practice, we know that we will have quite a few smaller targets that will never be able to implement exactly the structure that is presented. Speak not only about the change in the relative shares of different sources of revenues, but also about the quality of revenues, and particularly in two respects. Is the quality of intergovernmental fiscal transfers. And the whole challenge of kind of recentralization of transfers, of central government transfers, and making them more and more conditional at the expense of discretionary grants is there, particularly for developing countries. I'm coming now from a conference on local government finance in Uganda. The minister is speaking at the moment. And the share of discretionary grants in the total grants is about 5% for local governments and urban areas in Uganda. Now, for developed countries, this is anywhere on the order of 30 to 40%. So that qualitative aspect is very significant. The other, when we are talking about own source revenues, is transition to more income in elastic revenue sources of revenues in the composition of own source revenues. As things are now at the moment, most of the sources are extremely income elastic. And in a situation when the economic activity is hit, as it is now under COVID-19, so do the revenues. So again, transitioning to less income elastic revenues and introducing relevant regulations and policy framework is a topical issue, because those payments, even if they are deferred at the moment, will eventually, are supposed eventually to be paid, unlike the sources of revenues that are directly linked to economic activities. So these are my 2 points. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. I think you have also echoed some of the key points that we were dealing with earlier in the discussion, and your arrival is very timely. I think the momentum to centralize or re-centralize, as even Dr. Azmizam alluded to in the Malaysian context, and I think you can find it echoed everywhere. And of course, the inelasticity of financing is a major concern. You know, how do we build back better? And do we actually, dare I say, have to also realize that there will actually be losers in this system, and what are the social safety net that we have to have? On that note, colleagues, this has been a very stimulating, very enriching experience for me. I would really like to thank Marco and the team, Bruno, Paula, Hannes, for all your preparatory work. And also for all of you for your inputs. Please do send in your comments, make them as critical as possible, because we want to make this chapter as robust as possible. And of course to Eduardo for summation. I beg your indulgence for us to stay on a few extra minutes, and I would like to pass the mic to our director, Mr. Raf Toots, to conclude. Raf, over to you.
Thank you, Neil. And indeed, it was a very stimulating discussion, as it was also yesterday. And I'm seeing now a very good pattern coming for this report, with very critical and constructive review and comments from this time from Edlam, Dimitri, Diego, and Serge. I think all four provided very good perspectives to this work, and I think a lot of inspiration to Bruno, Hannes, Philip, and Marco, and some questions to ponder on in the coming weeks to finalize this jointly with the other chapter. And I think this is one of the issues that came up. Possible overlaps, connections between these four chapters. I would like to dwell on that a little bit, if I may. I think, yes, urban economy is definitely connected with morphology, with inequality, and with governance. And the commenters have explored these connection points. But I think we need to make sure that, yes, we, from an urban economy perspective, we're going to explore these different boundaries, like Sergio has suggested, like Diego has suggested, like Edlam has suggested, but without going into the other territory of the chapters. I think that's now the challenge, to demarcate, to keep the urban economic identity, touching on the others, but staying within the urban economic realm. And I think we're going to have a very, very strong chapter. Yes, we may have to bring in back some of the elements that were in the longer version, as long as they contribute and are relevant. I take note of some of the very strong recommendations to avoid disconnect between national and local, between formal and informal, and also make sure that the scales that we so well developed yesterday, from the regional scale to the city scale to the neighborhood scale, are also reflected where relevant from this urban economy perspective. And finally, the issue of inclusion, I think, came very strongly. Let's look at this chapter again from an inclusion lens and see what needs to be refined in that regard. Next steps, indeed, we're going to, the team will very carefully look at all the comments. If there's any written comments, please send them as soon as possible, definitely by the 10th of December, when we are closing this series of 4 webinars. We will then put together these 4 comments and put with the proper conclusions, and we will have to prioritize also the different recommendations that coming out of the 4 chapters, and that will happen by the end of January or February, when we will come out with a publication. And that publication, I would like to say, is only the beginning. It's not the end. It's the beginning of a new way for UN Habitat to take into account pandemics in its normative guidance to member states, to cities, and your comments in that regard have been extremely helpful, and we are so grateful for your engagement. One of the things that came up yesterday, I would like to repeat, and maybe this is also useful for this group, is that we may intend to create a platform for studies on this topic, which will no doubt come out after the publication of this report, so that any impact studies on economic dimension of this can also then be harnessed, and we could play a role as a follow-up of this publication. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone, Paolo and their team, the lead writers, the commenters, Neil as a wonderful facilitator, and also Eduardo. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the next webinar.
Thank you, and over to Bruno.
Well, I think the conclusion has been said. I also like to thank everybody, all the panel members on behalf of the team, and we take this forward also with the other chapter writers for this publication. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.